This is part 2 in our series of the December 1864 Pollard expedition. If you haven't had a chance to watch our first one titled Prelude, you'll want to do that first. With the Federal Expeditionary Force from Fort Barrancas, Florida assembled, Col George D Robinson, 97th U.S. Colored Infantry, commanding, had 2 separate brigades ready to begin the march. The cavalry was commanded by Lieutenant Colonel Andrew B. Sperling. It consisted of the 2nd Maine Cavalry, Major Charles Miller commanding, the 1st Florida Cavalry, Captain Francis Lyons commanding, and Company M of the 14th New York Cavalry, Lieutenant Lanark commanding. The Infantry Brigade was made up entirely of U.S. colored troops under the command of Lieutenant Colonel George Yarrington. It consisted of the 82nd U.S. Colored Infantry, Lieutenant Colonel George Tucker commanding, the 86th U.S. Colored Infantry, Captain Joseph Calais commanding, and the 97th U.S. Colored Infantry under the temporary command of Captain Michael McDonough. The expedition also included 2 mountain howitzers manned by a detachment of the 2nd Maine Cavalry and a train of 48 wagons. The objective of the expedition was to destroy portions of the Mobile to Montgomery Railroad, burn the town of Pollard, Alabama, and destroy all Confederate railroad, quartermaster, and commissary supplies. As customary in Federal incursions, the emancipation of slave laborers and their families was also expected. Multiple rebel outposts were along the route to alert Confederate forces in Mobile and the additional rebel forces in the area. In addition, bad roads, flooding, destroyed bridges, bridge repair, and armed resistance were clear expectations. At this stage in the war, General Sherman's Federal columns had marched through Georgia and were on the outskirts of Savannah. Hood's forces had dug in on the outskirts of Nashville and were just days away from the opening of battle. Multiple raids were striking deeper into the interior from multiple fronts. Alabama's manpower, manufacturing, and agriculture were being stretched to their limits. Confederate reports, dated December 12, 1864, the day prior to the start of the expedition, called attention to the urgency of protecting Mobile, Alabama from Federal strikes. Lieutenant General Taylor wrote the governor of Alabama, "The occupation of the lower bay by the enemy's fleet renders the city of Mobile liable to an attack at any moment. This vulnerable point should surely not be neglected." On the same day, Major General Murray, commanding forces at Mobile, reported that Federal forces were moving down west of Pascagoula and advancing towards Mobile. Those Federal forces were General Davidson and Bailey's 4,000 cavalry that arrived at Pascagoula on the 13th of December at the conclusion of a 19-day raid that had begun in Baton Rouge. General Granger was also making plans to press towards Mobile from the southwest. On the morning of December 13, 1864, the men of the 97th U.S. Colored Infantry received orders to be in readiness for the march scheduled to begin at noon. Along with other regiments of infantry and cavalry, they began the expedition at Camp Barrancas, Florida. Leaving the earthwork defenses, the long column of horses, mules, wagons, and men marched toward Pensacola by circling the western head of the bayou. Late in the afternoon, Colonel Robinson ordered Lieutenant Colonel Spurling to leave the main column and proceed in advance with the 2nd Maine Cavalry to Pine Barren Ridge. The cavalry raced forward, hoping to arrive in the darkness of night to catch the enemy pickets and guards by surprise and repair the bridge enough for the trains to cross. The infantry continued its 13-mile march to reach a point 2 miles beyond Jackson's Bridge, where they encamped for the night in the pine woods with the cavalry 15 miles ahead. During the night, 3 rebels came into camp and gave themselves up. Riding rapidly through the night, Spurling's cavalry arrived within a mile of the Pine Barren Creek bridge and concealed the horses and men in the woods to get some much-needed rest. He then sent Lieutenant Glidden with a small dismounted force down the creek to the railroad bridge to get in the rear of the pickets and capture the post. The abandoned bridge was in bad condition. Water in the creek had swollen from the recent rains and the current was swift. The troopers were forced to ford across, slowing them down. At 6 in the morning, 2 rebels were captured on the road. Only 1 man had been left on duty at the bridge, but he evaded capture. Rising in the darkness, the men of the 97th U.S. Colored Infantry were up at 3, while the 86th U.S. Colored Infantry had reveille at 4. The infantrymen resumed the march at 4:30 in the morning, more than an hour before sunrise. By 11, the men had passed west of Pensacola, turned north, taking a very good road through the woods, parallel to the railroad grade. Reaching Gonzales Farm, near the crossroads, the men rejoined the waiting cavalry, having marched about 25 miles before encamping for the evening. During that time, Lieutenant Colonel Spurling's troopers of the 2nd Maine Cavalry had crossed the bridge, repaired it, and placed guards to protect it while waiting for Colonel Robinson and the main column to come up in the evening. Reveille awoke the infantry at 2 in the morning on the 15th. Having received intelligence that the rebels planned to make a stand at Bluff Springs, Spurling took the 2nd Maine Cavalry and pushed on ahead, making a detour by the road to the right of Bluff Springs in order to cut the telegraph wire and, if not finding the enemy, to secure the Escambia Bridge. Colonel Robinson moved up the direct road towards Pollard with the 1st Florida Cavalry. Company M, 14th New York Cavalry remained with the infantry. After breakfast, the infantry began the next leg of the march at 3 a.m. The 97th U.S. Colored Infantry guarded the wagon train and the nearly 300 horses and mules pulling them as they trudged forward. Company J of the 86th U.S. Colored Infantry marched ahead as skirmishers. At 5 in the morning, near the Pine Barren Bridge, the infantry halted and waited 20 minutes for the wagon train to come up. At about 9 a.m., Spurling's cavalry came upon the rebel camp near Bluff Springs, known as Camp Lomax. The Confederates, about 200 men of the 15th Confederate Cavalry, put up a short resistance but were routed and driven from their position. As the rebels retreated, the Federal cavalry pursued them to the Escambia Bridge, where the enemy crossed and fired the bridge after making a brief stand behind breastworks on the opposite side. An hour later, the flames were extinguished by the cavalry and repairs to the bridge were quickly started and completed in just a few hours. A howitzer was placed in position to rake the road to protect their crossing should the enemy attempt to return. While the bridge was being repaired, Lieutenant Colonel Sperling and a portion of the 2nd Maine and 1st Florida thrust 4 miles up the Escambia to get possession of an additional bridge. On the way, a small station on the Mobile and Great Northern Railroad, about 6 miles from Pollard, near Miles, Alabama, was captured. The station master and 50 able-bodied Negroes working on the railroad were also apprehended. A train coming from Mobile approached the station when the cavalry force arrived. Attempting to capture the train, the cavalrymen awaited its arrival. 2 lieutenants were dispatched to move up along the roadbed, get to the rear of the train, and obstruct the track. Unfortunately, through the indiscretion of a captain who exposed himself on the tracks with his sword drawn in his hand, the plan was discovered and the train eluded capture and returned towards Mobile. On the east side of the river, 30 men held a stockade built to defend the railroad bridge. The bridge over the Big Escambia was significant. It was a 661-foot truss with 11 spans 45 feet apart. On the east side of the river, 30 men held a stockade built to defend the railroad bridge. An exchange of fire ensued, and the cavalry returned fire with its carbines. In a shower of bullets, Sperling moved forward and personally set the bridge ablaze. In dropping down to the framework of the bridge, he bumped his head and fell into the river. For a while, he was thought killed, but soon appeared covered in blood and dirt, which stayed upon him for several hours before time permitted it to be removed. With the railroad trestle aflame, destruction of the rail line commenced, and the rail was torn up for a long distance. 1,000 sacks of corn were found at the station and were also burned. As Sperling supervised the tearing up of the track and completing the destruction of the trestle, he was informed that the bridge, which the rebels had set fire to previously in the day, had been sufficiently repaired to allow the passage of troops and wagons to cross. He received orders to rejoin the column and continue the march towards Pollard. With the bridge repaired and the return of Sperling's small cavalry force, the march resumed at 2:30 p.m. The 2nd Maine and 1st Florida Cavalry pressed forward to secure the next bridge crossing at the Little Escambia. Lieutenant Colonel Yarrington's brigade of infantry resumed the march and pressed forward as fast as possible. Upon reaching the bridge, only 2 miles from Pollard, the enemy opened a brisk fire on the advance guard of the cavalry. The bridge had been destroyed to prevent its crossing, and the enemy had taken up a strong position. Robinson deployed the artillery and had Captain Roberts, Company M, 2nd Maine Cavalry, bring up the 2 howitzers to sweep the bridge. The cavalry dismounted and were deployed as skirmishers, placed on either side of the road, the 1st Florida on the right and the 2nd Maine on the left. A short and sharp engagement ensued, during which 6 shots of grape and shell were fired by the artillery and volley after volley were fired by the carbines. Unable to stand up to the fire, the enemy broke and fled from their position in confusion. Giving chase, the 1st Florida forded the stream a short distance below as the 2nd Maine crossed on the stringers of what remained of the bridge and followed them on foot for some distance. Becoming dark, Robinson ordered them to cease their pursuit and return. In the meantime, the infantry had arrived. During the evening, the bridge was repaired as the men bivouacked for the night. Reveille woke the infantry at 5 in the morning on December 16th. The cavalry had already mounted and advanced to Pollard beforehand. They made a detour by a road to the left of town and, arriving there at sunrise without opposition, found the town abandoned. Upon entering the town, Sperling sent a detachment of the 1st Florida up the Alabama and Florida Railroad to destroy an important trestle a short distance above Pollard towards Montgomery. According to Major Eben Hutchinson, 2nd Maine Cavalry, at Pollard,
the track was torn up. The rails were so ruined by fire they cannot be made use of again. All the public buildings burned, 2 large and valuable depots, several warehouses and storehouses filled with materials of all kinds, large amounts of quartermaster's property, ordnance, clothing, camp and garrison equipage was destroyed. More than 700,000 pounds of corn were burned, as well as a small amount of rolling stock on the railroad. Everything it could be made use of was destroyed.
the infantry brigade arrived later that morning, some regiments by 9 and others by 10 in the morning. Captain Chamberlain, 97th U.S. Colored Infantry, reported that nearly all the whole town was destroyed. The cavalry and a portion of the infantry were then asked to destroy the bridges and railroad tracks in the surrounding area of Pollard. Another task to be accomplished was securing the next water crossing for the continuing march. In order to cross the Conecuh River 2 miles from Pollard and take the road on the east side of the Escambia, the ferry boats known to be used for that purpose had to be secured. Colonel Robinson dispatched Colonel Yarrington and a regiment of infantry and a howitzer to the Conecuh to capture the ferry boats. The 86th U.S. Colored Infantry was sent up the road where it halted at the swollen river. There it was discovered that the ferry boats had been removed by the enemy upon them hearing of their approach. Informed of the situation, Robinson rode to the location and personally inspected the river crossing. He determined it would be impossible to construct a bridge in less than 2 days. The smoke of Pollard's destruction bellowed into the sky and was likely seen for several miles. In the afternoon, a train approached Pollard from the direction of Montgomery. Seeing what was transpiring ahead, it went back immediately. At about the same time, a courier arrived from Barrancas with orders for Robinson's strike force to return at once. This courier was likely the very reliable scout that Brigadier General Thomas McKean had gathered valuable information from the previous evening. That scout reported that there were about 2,000 rebel troops without artillery in that part of the country. The scout's report was fairly well corroborated by statements by several rebel deserters. In correspondence, McKean reported, "I sent the scout to Colonel Robinson in command of the expedition in order that he might have the benefit of this information." With the courier's information and the objective of the expedition completed, and the recognition that trains coming from both the direction of Mobile and Montgomery had likely alerted the enemy, Robinson decided to recall the troops and ready for the return march. By 3 in the afternoon, the column began heading back to Barrancas, returning by the same route of the advance. In our next video, we'll cover the return march, which also includes the charge of the 97th across the Little Escambia Bridge, fighting at Canoe Creek and Mitchell's Creek, and the epic midnight battle at Pine Barren Ford.